Hi guys, today I'll be taking a look at this, the IBM 5251 with IBM Beam spring switches. Let's get started. Now, the IBM Model B or IBM Beam spring keyboards, as they are more commonly known, came with a terminal computer. This keyboard specifically came with the IBM 5150, a family of block-oriented terminals. If you're interested, you can pause the video now to read its highlighted features. Now, if it isn't obvious yet, the keyboard itself is comically big. I mean, this is how it looks like next to a modern office keyboard, the Logitech K120. It's an insane difference. But what about price? How much is one of these? Well, you might want to take a deep breath. There are two currently on eBay, a 3278 and a 5251, just like what I'm showing you. However, a display writer sold for about £1,500 and a 5251 sold for over £700 earlier this year. So yeah, these are in the upper echelons when it comes to pricing, so they are outside most people's budget. I mean, many of these cost more than a high-end custom build. However, there are alternatives. Kind of. And the alternatives are by Model F Labs. Now, I say this is kind of an alternative since the R2 Beam spring models are still in group buy stages. However, one of the main goals of the project is to provide Beam spring keyboards for a much more reasonable price. Now, moving on to the switches, these are the legendary IBM Beam spring switches. Now, the way these switches work is quite interesting. Essentially, the switch stem is connected to a metal strip, the beam spring, which is held under tension. When you press the switch with enough force to overcome the tension, the beam spring buckles and the fly plate attached to the beam springs gets lifted from the PCB. This then causes a change in capacitance, which in turn actuates the switch, as well as providing a distinct tactile and clicky feel. For the return travel, this external spring pushes the stem upwards to reset the switch. Finally, these switches are physically very tall. Here it is next to a Cherry MX Brown for comparison. Now that you know all that, let's move on to the keyboard characteristics. Now, the base is made of a very heavy metal. It's heavier than a full-size gaming keyboard and almost as much as my work laptop. That is seriously impressive. The top is made of a very thick and durable plastic. In one area, it's thicker than my iPad. In terms of dimensions, the keyboard is roughly 54 cm long, 21 cm wide, and 9 cm tall. The keyboard doesn't come with flip-out feet, but you won't be needing that here. It also weighs 5.2 kg including the cable. Moving on to the keycaps, they are double shot SAN or ABS. It really depended, but all of them are extremely thick. Over 2 mm and about 3 grams in weight. An R1 SA keycap from Domikey is only about 1.3 mm and weigh 2 grams. Now, its original cable is rather short, but again extremely well built. It's over 10 mm thick and weigh 244 grams, which is heavier than most modern smartphones. Overall, IBM did not cheap out on this keyboard. It's very well built and it's no surprise they've lasted this long. 10 out of 10. Now, if it isn't obvious yet, this is a vintage keyboard, so it doesn't really come with any modern features. There's no Hotswap, no RGB, and no USB connection. I mean, it doesn't even have F keys. However, it has one absolutely outstanding feature that you only find in Model Bs: beam spring switches. And in my opinion, that alone is a feature in itself. Additionally, many Model Bs came with solenoids, including this one, which made typing on these even louder. Overall, even though these keyboards have one of the best switches ever made, it doesn't make up for the lack of modern features that we now take for granted. 2 out of 10. Now, I must admit, I couldn't use this keyboard on a daily basis since the conversion worked intermittently and a lot of features were missing that I normally use. However, I firstly want to talk about the typing angle. It's extremely high given the height of the switches, and I can't imagine it being comfortable for long periods. Secondly, as I've already hinted, it's missing a whole bunch of keys compared to a modern keyboard, which I know is programmable with software, but I figured I'd mention it anyway. Lastly, the spacebar is heavier than the rest of the keys, which is common in many vintage keyboards, but I'm personally not a big fan of that. Overall, as satisfying as it was to use beam spring switches, this keyboard isn't super adaptable in the modern world, which honestly makes me quite sad because I do like this, but I wish it was a bit more modern. 4 out of 10. Now, these keyboards tend to be very reliable if they haven't rusted to bits yet, which by the way can happen to these if poorly maintained. Speaking of which, this 5251 isn't in the best shape either. There are keys that don't click and the field backspace key is quite heavy and refuses to reset. Additionally, all my stabilizers have some level of rust in them, so keeping these well maintained is absolutely crucial. However, unlike many modern keyboards, these don't have cheap keycaps or RGB LEDs that need replacing down the line, so it's not all bad news. Overall, even though beam spring switches are more complicated than your standard MX switch, they're still very reliable. Just remember to give this keyboard some TLC every now and then. 9 out of 10. Now, as I've mentioned, these keyboards are not cheap. They range in price depending on the model, the condition, and if any restoration or work has been done to them. An IBM 5251, like my example, tend to be the cheapest. They start around £600 for a decent one and go up from there. I've seen rarer beam spring keyboards sell for over £2,000. Yeah. Also, you'll have to buy a converter if you want to use one of these on a modern PC, which, yes, does cost a bit of money, about £50 or so. However, despite their high price tag, I actually found it really hard to give these value. Think about it, they're very unique, historically significant, have amazing switches and a fantastic build quality. Overall, if you're an enthusiast and money is no object, then sure, go for it. But for many of us, this is a lot of money for a keyboard. 4 out of 10. Now let's move on to the switch characteristics. On-center key presses are very smooth with only some binding on slow key presses. Off-center key presses aren't as smooth with more noticeable binding on more keys at slower key presses. Overall, given their age, they're still smoother than some modern switches. I can only imagine how they would be like brand new. 7 out of 10. Now, according to IBM, these switches have an actuation force of 55 grams around 2.5mm, a total travel of about 3.8mm and resets around 1mm. Now, here's a force curve I recorded for the IBM Beam spring switches. My measurements shown one of them to be 15 grams heavier, probably due to their age, but the rest seem to be within margin of error. However, they weren't very consistent, with all three switches showing levels of deviation on both down and the upstroke, but more so on the downstroke. Now here's a force curve comparison between the beam spring and its successor, the capacitive buckling spring. I like them both, but it's not really a fair comparison since they're very different switch technologies. Now here it is against the Cherry MX Blue. Again, this is just for fun so you can see the differences. Overall, despite their inconsistencies on graph, they feel very consistent in practice and I absolutely love their weighting. 10 out of 10. Now, these are very unique switches and so is their sound. It's a bit hard to describe, but a colleague of mine says they sound like a machine gun with the solenoid on. Speaking of which, some beam spring keyboards came with a solenoid to make them even louder. Unfortunately, the solenoid on this model is faulty, so I couldn't fully enjoy them. Overall, these would be a perfect 10, but they have a bit of ping which I don't like, but the solenoid masks this, so take your pick. 9 out of 10. Now take a listen and enjoy. Now, these switches were somewhat based on the IBM Selectrek typewriter switches, so yes, they were made for typing. And IBM nailed them. These are one of the smoothest clicky switches I know of. They have a distinct tactile feel and aren't too heavy, unlike membrane buckling springs that would come later in the mid-80s. Overall, these are perfectly weighted, and if it wasn't for the awkward typing angle, I'd use these more often. 10 out of 10. Now, if you haven't been paying attention, these switches have an insane amount of hysteresis, so they won't be ideal for any competitive gaming. However, unlike some modern switches, these feel amazing to game on. They're smooth and relatively consistent. Plus, my example isn't even in the best shape. I mean, it's not falling to bits, but it's not brand new either. Overall, I wish these weren't as heavily used, but even in their condition, they're still absolutely amazing. Sure, I don't recommend them for gaming generally, but you could use them for that if you really wanted to. 6 out of 10. In conclusion, this keyboard is absolutely amazing. I honestly want another one, perhaps a cleaner one. Plus, it's making me want one of those Beam Spring reproductions even more, which should start shipping by the end of this year, so not long now. The final score for this keyboard is 26 out of 50, or 52%, ranking it lower than average given its poor feature set, but that's actually not too bad for a vintage keyboard overall. The final score for this switch is 42 out of 50, or 84%, which is near the top of the score, matching a couple of modern clicky switches. Not bad for a 50-year-old. And that's it. I'll be back showing you modern stuff, but do let me know if you'd like to see more vintage keyboard content. Until then, take care and goodbye.